going to be speaking today about Islamist anti-Semitism in the contemporary Middle East. A very important subject. Jonathan he's been a journalist and Middle East analyst who's traveled the region and he gets into places you wonder how he gets in, and more importantly, how he can get out. Another interesting thing, he's been a research fellow at the Jerusalem Institute for Strategic and Security, and now is the Director of Education, which is not in the bio, of the Middle East Forum, which is a very important research center and policy center in the United States, and it's expanded into Canada. Joe Allen, who's around, he's the other group. He's with us, he's one of Jonathan's colleagues, and does great work in the Canadian, North American context of radical Islam. And Jonathan is a well-published journalist and author and analyst and scholar. He's been coming here for many years, and so it's really a privilege to hear us. So thanks for taking the time.
So good afternoon to everybody. I hope I'm audible through this microphone. If I'm not, then I can start sort of shouting and screaming, but hopefully we can avoid that, at least until the question and answer session. Okay, so to get straight to the issue, let me begin by saying that the Middle East today is, by most measures, the most anti-Semitic region in the world. It is a region in which, perhaps uniquely in contemporary times, negative stereotypes of Jews, including ideas of Jewish conspiracy and nefarious and occult Jewish control of world power centers, exist freely in the cultural mainstream. And you can find manifold examples of these in popular media and cultural production in the modern Middle East. One need not spend a great deal of time traveling in the Middle East and conversing with locals before making the acquaintance of the rich variety of entirely negative stereotypes and conspiracy theories regarding Jews, which form a central element of mainstream political discussion in the region. And what I want to do in this talk, or attempt to do, is to look into the nature and the reasons for the pervasiveness and indeed near ubiquitousness of anti-Semitism in the contemporary Middle East. And I want to then, at the end, consider the position and role of political Islam in general in this picture, and of two specific anti-Semitic Islamist movements, namely the Lebanese Hezbollah and the Palestinian Hamas movement, within this larger picture. And I guess we'll talk about this for about an hour or so, and then we'll have time for discussion at the end. So first of all, evidence for the claim, I have water, thank you, Charles, of the ubiquitous presence of anti-Semitism in the contemporary Middle East. A poll undertaken by the respected Pew Research Center for its Pew Global Attitudes Project in 2010 looked into attitudes towards Jews in a variety of countries, both in the Middle East and outside it. And the picture that it produced with regard to the Middle East was not encouraging, I think we can say. In Lebanon, fully 97% of those surveyed had an unfavorable or very unfavorable view of Jews. This included 99% of both the Sunni and Shia Muslims. The 97% figure derived from the only slightly less unfavorable view to be found among Lebanese Christians. In Egypt, the figures were 95% with unfavorable or very unfavorable views to 3% with favorable or very favorable views. And in Jordan, the relative figures were 96% to 3%. The 2010 poll, by the way, showed a slight increase in levels of hostility to Jews in these countries. In a previous poll in 2008, the figures for all three of the aforementioned states had shown, nevertheless, more than 95% of respondents still having either an unfavorable or very unfavorable view of Jews. In non-Arab Muslim countries, interestingly, the levels of unfavorable views towards Jews were lower. though still striking. In Turkey, for example, the percentages expressing either an unfavorable or very unfavorable attitude towards Jews was 76%, against only 7% having a favorable or very favorable view. In Pakistan, the figures were 76% to 4%. In Indonesia, 66% to 10%. For the purposes of comparison, among the countries polled, those with the highest number of favorable or very favorable attitudes to Jews were the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, with 77, 73, and 79% respectively. So the empirical evidence for the current near ubiquitousness of anti-Semitic attitudes in the Arab countries bordering Israel is clear and very striking. Middle East historian Bernard Lewis, writing in the 1980s, wrote that the volume of anti-Semitic literature published in the Arab world and its wide audience and the apparent authority of its sponsors suggested, in Lewis's view, that classical anti-Semitism of the formerly Western type had become an essential part of the intellectual life of the Arabic-speaking world, considerably more in Lewis's judgment than had been the case in 19th and early 20th century France, and in his view to a degree comparable to the situation in Nazi Germany. But while the evidence for the current pervasive presence of anti-Semitism in the Middle East is overwhelming, interpreting its cause or causes is more complex. And broadly, I wish to suggest there are two schools which seek to account for this, and I am going to call them the modernist and the perennialist schools. The modernist school holds that anti-Semitism is a phenomenon emerging from the Western Christian world. And this view considers that while Jews undoubtedly experienced a legally subordinate status in the Muslim world, this did not translate into widespread persecution and hatred. Rather, the relatively small and entirely powerless Jewish communities of the Muslim world were a matter, in this view, of little concern and attention throughout most of the period following the establishment of Islam and its conquest of the Middle East. Indeed, according to this view, the protected or dhimmi status afforded Jews throughout this period in that place offered them a degree of physical security and protection often not available in the Christian world. According to this view, anti-Semitism of the ideological and virulent type began to grow and spread in the Muslim world with the encroachment of Western ideas and Western power in the 19th century and the breakdown of the Ottoman Empire and traditional Islamic society. The conflict between Jews and Arabs in Israel-Palestine, according to this view, then greatly exacerbated anti-Jewish feelings. So to quote Esther Webman, for example, a proponent of this school, she wrote in 1994 that, quote, anti-Semitism did not exist in the traditional Islamic world. It is, in fact, a relatively new phenomenon gaining ground particularly since the eruption of the Arab-Israeli conflict in the mid-20th century, close quotes. The perennialist view, by contrast, holds that this interpretation fails to take account of the sometimes virulent discrimination and the examples of persecution and murder experienced by Jews prior to the coming of the West in modern times to the Middle East. And these views seek to undermine, of course, among other things, the view commonly expressed of a golden age of Islamic tolerance in the High Middle Ages, in, for example, Islamic Spain of that period, and they do so by producing counterexamples of prejudice and violence against Jews. This school sometimes also seeks to locate the roots of anti-Semitism in the Middle East within the texts and praxis of Islam itself, noting examples of anti-Jewish sentiment in the Quran and the Hadith. Which of these interpretations then best fits with the available historical record? Observation of the evidence suggests that the distinction between the two schools, whilst undoubtedly of some explanatory power, is a somewhat artificial one in the sense that both explanations contain elements that have explanatory power regarding the present situation, as I want to now go on to try and illustrate. Looking first of all at the issue of Islam itself. Islam, as is famously known and is known probably to everybody here, clashed with the Jews or with particular Jews from its earliest period. 3 Jewish tribes lived in the area of Medina. These were the Banu Nadir, the Banu Qaynuqa, and the famous Banu Qurayza, who lived among the larger at that time polytheistic community of Arabia. And little in detail is known of these tribes, and they're often referred to in the literature as Judaized Bedouin, in that they appear to have differed in no significant way from the surrounding population and to have formed an accepted element of society. The conflict between these tribes and Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, began with Muhammad's migration from Mecca to Medina, where the Jewish tribes rejected his apostolate and resisted his political and military leadership, according to Islamic sources. And the conflict resulted in Muhammad's defeat of the Jewish tribes and the extermination of one of them, the Bani Qurayza. And in the Quran and Hadith and Sunnah, the Jews of Medina specifically are depicted as stubborn, rebelling against the commandments of God and seeking to kill his messenger or messengers. The Quran, Surah 5, verse 82, for example, states that, quote, "You will surely find that the people most hostile to the believers are the Jews and the pagans." However, classical Islamic literature has treated these episodes as fairly minor events in the history of Muhammad, which in any case resulted and ended with the utter defeat of the Jews. As Surah 2, verse 61 of the Quran puts it, they were afflicted with humiliation and poverty, and they felt the wrath of God, and this was because they used to disbelieve the signs of God and kill his messengers unjustly. This was because they disobeyed and transgressed, close quotes. And following Muhammad's death from 632 to 661, Arab Muslim forces launched successful attacks against the Byzantine and Persian empires, adding much of their former territory to its own emergent empire. This period, of course, is led by Muhammad's successors, the famous first 4 caliphs, who acted as both religious and political rulers. During the 7th century, the majority of Middle Eastern Jewry had lived within the Byzantine Empire, whose territory included what are now Syria, Egypt, Israel, Jordan, and Lebanon. And many have been residing in such cities as Aleppo in northern Syria since biblical times, under various rulers. Byzantine policy dictated that all non-Christians, including the Jews, were burdened with high taxes and strict religious restrictions. There was tremendous pressure to convert to Christianity to avoid religious persecution. And groups of Jews also remained in Persia, suffering equally from the stringent rule of the Sassanid Empire. Both Byzantine and Sassanid empires famously had failed to anticipate the full capacity of the Arab force, were caught by surprise, were exhausted from decades of war against one another, and thus Muslim victory was quick and complete. And as a result of this Muslim victory and the consequent conquest by Islam of large areas outside Arabia for the first time, a large number of ancient Jewish communities now come under Islamic rule. And Islam is now faced for the first time with the challenge of governance of large numbers of both Jews and Christians. There's large numbers of non-Muslims, including both Jews and Christians. So how does Islam respond? The first and second Pacts of Omar, named after the second Caliph of Islam and Omar II, the Umayyad Caliph, respectively, codified first the conditions under which Jews and Christians were to live under Islam. As an aside, or in parentheses, whether these pacts truly date back to these venerated figures or whether they were introduced by later jurists who then tried to use their names is a moot point outside of the bounds of this discussion, I suppose. But in any case, these pacts represented and represent the basic text defining relations between Muslims and the Ahl al-Kitab, the peoples of the book, under Islamic rule. Let's look at them then in a little bit of detail. According to the Pact of Omar, Jews and Christians are granted the right to practice their own religious rights. Protection of Christians and Jews and their property is part of the pact. Manifesting their religion publicly or converting anyone to it was prohibited, as was keeping their children from becoming Muslim. Jews and Christians were required to wear clothing or signs differentiating them from Muslims. The public sphere was to be a completely Islamic environment. So dhimmis were prohibited from building or repairing places of worship without the permission of the Muslim leaders. Their places of worship famously could not be as high as mosques, and bells and the public display of crosses on churches were banned for Christians. To secure their rights, non-Muslims would pledge loyalty to their Muslim rulers and would pay a special poll tax, the famous jizya, for adult males. Their testimony in court was not equal to that of a Muslim. The Jews could not bear arms. They also could not ride horses. Many of the conditions of the Pact of Omar are still held up as the ideal model for the treatment of non-Muslims among Orthodox classical Muslim theologians. The conditions of the pact were authoritative. The level of enforcement, however, varied considerably in the areas of Islamic rule, as shown by the existence of churches, for example, constructed long after Muslim conquest in areas of Islamic rule. In practice, at least up until the 13th century, certain regulations were not strictly enforced. Incidentally, in particular with relation to Jews, who were generally able to integrate in Muslim lands better than Christians, for reasons which we can perhaps discuss a bit later on. In early Muslim Spain, for example, Jews were not obliged to dress differently from Muslims, it's just an example, and were often noted in the existing literature for their use of fine silks and linen apparel. It's also a fact, as evidence from the Cairo Geniza, that during the Fatimid dynasty's rule in Egypt, for example, Jews were frequently able to get involved in the business of governance. But of course, the relatively peaceful life available, at least at times, to Jews as dhimmis, was dependent on their remaining obedient. And the history of the period is replete with examples of the unfortunate fate of Jews who were perceived as having transgressed or got above themselves. Indeed, writings by Jews from that period, as contained in the Cairo Geniza, even use a specific term derived from Hebrew, but not exactly mirroring, at least modern Hebrew, which is sinut, used to refer to hostility from local Muslims towards Jews, and the resentment of this, or the resentment contained therein, occasionally, and we have this in the record, spilled over into outright violence. So quite a couple of examples of this, just very briefly. A contemporary poem by one Abu Ishaq, a non-Jew, who helped to incite a pogrom in Granada in 1066, contains the following passage. Do not consider it a breach of faith to kill them. The breach of faith will be to let them carry on. They have violated our covenant with them, so how can you be held guilty against the violators? Here we find a manifestation, I think, of a distinct brand of Islamic anti-Semitism, or anti-Jewish prejudice, if you prefer, significantly differing from its Western counterpart. It holds to the central view that the Jews are most hostile to Islam's revelations among humanity, and are also prone to treachery in dealings with others, and to arrogant self-righteousness, slaying Allah's messengers and prophets, and other such forms of evil conduct. Regarding the massacre of the Jews in Granada, which the Abu Ishaq's poem is concerned and which he helped to incite, it's worth remembering that these massacres led to more deaths of Jews than the much more famous destruction by the Crusaders of the Jewish communities of the Rhineland 30 years earlier at the outset of the First Crusade. Nevertheless, such outbreaks of violence were the exception rather than the rule. And again, to reiterate, and this is important for what comes next, they took place usually relating to a sense that the Jews had got above themselves and therefore had come to constitute a threat. In general, Jews and Christians under Muslim rule were not subject to physical expulsion. The one major exception to this rule, of course, is Arabia itself. Caliph Omar expelled all Jews and Christians from the Hijaz area in line with the hadith, which says 2 religions shall not remain in the land of the Arabs. But in significant ways, nevertheless, the life of Jews under Muslim rule did favourably compare to the situation in Christian Europe. Jews were rarely forced to change their religion, for example. Unlike in Europe, they were rarely confined in territorial or occupational ghettos, with some exceptions. They enjoyed freedom of worship and some autonomy in communal affairs. And while formally subject to a whole series of legal, fiscal, and political disabilities, as we've noted, the application of these varied quite considerably from time to time and from place to place. That is to say, the situation affecting Jewish and Christian minorities in the High Middle Ages, I would suggest, falls obviously far short of the standards set in modern democracies. It nevertheless compares favourably with conditions prevailing in Western Europe at the time. However, it didn't last. Remember, the relative tolerance afforded to Jews and Christians was dependent on their not being perceived as a threat. The view of the Jew as a defeated foe in Islam, by the way, is key here. In the Islamic, as in the Christian foundational narratives, the Jew is a hostile and malevolent force. But, unlike in the Christian context, the Jew's malevolence ends in his defeat. As Lewis puts it, and this is a quote, this basic difference between the Jew's success against Christ and his failure against Muhammad had a decisive influence on the attitudes of the Jew haters of the 2 religions. For the Christian, the Jew represented a dark and deadly power capable of deeds of cosmic evil. For the Muslim, he might be hostile, cunning, and vindictive, but he was weak and ineffectual, an object of ridicule rather than fear. This lack of dangerousness attributed to the Jews in the Muslim world worked in their favour, paradoxically perhaps. But of course, it did so only in periods when the Muslim host community itself felt sufficiently secure. As the Muslim world came to feel itself increasingly weak, put upon and surrounded, so it became increasingly suspicious of those non-Muslim communities in its midst, and their situation correspondingly began to decline. And if we think, for example, of a couple of examples from the Middle Ages period, the discriminatory policy of the Berber Almoravids who came to Spain in 1086, and then the even more fanatical and more famous Almohads who came a century later, we rapidly realize that any depiction of a golden age for Jews in Muslim Andalusia is a myth. The Almoravids directed their depredations mainly against Christians. It should be noted the Almohads came up with a very interesting basis for their policy, in that they abolished the dhimmi system. Generally, of course, the dhimma system we tend to think of as being something negative, so it sounds like a nice idea to abolish it. But not in the case of the Almohads, because the Almohads abolished the dhimma system, instead giving Jews the choice of conversion, exile, or death. So what they did was something worse than the dhimma system rather than improvement of it. It's interesting to note, in parentheses once again, that none other than, no less illustrious a figure than the Rambam, than Moses Maimonides, Moshe ben Maimon, was among those Jews who fled Spain as a result of this decree of the Almohads. And in this regard, it's worth remembering, and is useful for our discussion perhaps to remember, that even the Rambam did not seek refuge in the Christian world, remember. He fled from Muslim oppression in Spain, but where did he flee to? He fled to Egypt, where he became, as we know, a physician in the court of Salah ad-Din. So just to note the complexities here. So it meant then, to sum up, that the position of the Jews under Islam from its inception was one of institutionalized legal inferiority. This inferiority had no exception, but its implementation varied from place to place and time to time. The harshness of Muslim rule tended to correlate with the level of confidence and security felt by the Muslim rulers in their community, where they felt reason to suspect their Jewish or Christian subjects, so the harshness of their rule tended to increase. As the confidence of the Muslim dominion began to subside, as enemies attacked its borders, so its tolerance of non-Muslim minorities declined. And as the Muslim world began to become influenced by Western ideas, so Western anti-Semitism began to appear among Muslim communities, and this introduced a new virulence and new motifs into views of the Jews prevalent in the region. The arrival of the distinctive Christian type of hostility to Jews comes into the Islamic world in several interesting stages. It begins in the High Middle Ages with Christian converts to Islam. The second stage comes with the Ottoman expansion into Europe, which brought large numbers of Greek Orthodox Christians under Muslim rule. And the blood libel was endemic in those areas, and it came to the notice of the Ottoman authorities at that time through disturbances caused at Easter time, famously. And this was the first time that this particular version of anti-Jewish feeling had been seen in the Muslim world. Of course, we know that it didn't take long to catch on and to become popular, with a series in the course of the 19th century of accusations of ritual murder, most famous of which is the Damascus blood libel of 1840. But the real penetration of modern-style anti-Semitism begins in the 19th century. It begins among the Christian Arab minorities who had the closest contacts with the West. And it's during the second half of the 19th century that we see the first translations of European anti-Semitic writings coming into the Arabic-speaking world. Of course, the entry of Christian-style anti-Semitism into the Muslim world in the 19th century is not taking place in a vacuum. Rather, it forms part of a larger picture in which the Christian West, having overtaken the Muslim world in terms of societal and technological development, is now beginning to physically encroach upon the domains of Islam. And by the beginning of the 20th century, much of the Islamic world has been conquered by the European empires. And two related movements have arisen to combat Western power in the Middle East. These, of course, are Arab nationalism and political Islam, or Islamism. Each of these movements claimed to represent the authentic response of the region to Western incursion, but each also in its own way was deeply influenced by Western ideas. Arab nationalism, as is well known, inherits what we consider to be, often considered to be German ideas of romantic and organic nationalism through the encounter of Michel Aflach and Salah ad-Din al-Bitar, if these names mean anything to people, with those ideas while they were studying in Europe in the 1930s. Islamism also bears many hallmarks of a nationalist, revivalist movement, albeit one which sees the Islamic Ummah as the community which has been invaded and which needs to revive its authentic consciousness and practices in order to resist and fight back against invasion. The emergence of these two movements is coterminous with the emergence of modern Jewish nationalism or Zionism, and perhaps partly as a result of this, both Arab nationalism and political Islam in the Middle East from the very beginning are deeply permeated with anti-Jewish ideas and images in their literature and propaganda. The rise and triumph of Zionism and the emergence of the State of Israel represent a core trauma for the Islamic world in modernity. And let me consider this point a moment in terms of what we've already looked at. As we saw a few minutes ago, the traditional Islamic view of the Jews is one which might be described as contemptuous, but also largely indifferent. The Jews were a subaltern people with a clear, if inferior, place in Islamic society. That such a people had successfully rebelled against this status, and by doing so had even defeated Arab armies and re-established themselves in their ancient homeland, a place also of high importance to the Muslim and Arab worlds, represented a calamity of the first order. And the reversal of this situation remained and remains a matter of immense importance for millions throughout the Islamic world. The establishment of Israel thus constitutes a focal point for the coming together of a number of elements of central importance in the contemporary Islamic world. The sense of humiliation at the hands of the Christian West is personified, perhaps paradoxically, most strongly in the victory of the Jews on Islamic soil over Muslims. This sense of humiliation and the desire for revenge is fueled by the permeation of traditionally Christian ideas regarding the Jews as a noxious and powerful enemy into the Muslim world as a result of Western encroachment. Such ideas were alien to traditional Islamic society, but the Muslim world is today the place in which they flourish, while such ideas have, or maybe in 2025 I should say, had retreated to the fringes in the West. I mean to say, maybe I should say had, because maybe they are now returning from the fringes to the center in the West. This is something we can discuss. Muslim Brotherhood founder Hassan al-Banna conceived a view of the Jews and of Zionism impacted by these ideas very clearly as a sort of occult cosmic force against which it is a holy duty to fight. And such ideas remain manifest today among the spokespeople of political Islam. And we can think, for example, I'm just taking one example and I'm going to come up with others soon in a moment, but a statement by the once well-known Israel-based Islamist leader Raed Saleh, who once, by the way, visited the parliament here as a guest of a well-known politician called Jeremy Corbyn. And Saleh wrote the following after 9/11. He wrote that the one responsible for this act was the unique mover who wanted to carry out the bombings in Washington and New York in order to provide the Israeli establishment with a way out of its entanglements. The unique mover found a suitable way to warn the 4,000 Jews who worked at the World Trade Center so that they did not come into work on September 11th, 2001. Such ideas have not, however, come at the expense of the traditional Muslim view of the Jews. Rather, the two have joined together, combining into the image of the Jew commonly presented in the Islamic world today as simultaneously powerful and yet unworthy of the respect often afforded to power, violent and yet cowardly, and equally paradoxically perhaps, familiar, indeed perhaps eternal, and yet also somehow inauthentic. This complex of ideas, drawing from traditional Islamic, Christian, and modern secular leftist notions, constitutes the prism through which Jews and Israel are seen today in the mainstream of the Arab and Islamic worlds. So, both modernist and perennialist explanations for anti-Semitism in the modern Middle East contain elements of truth. The virulent anti-Semitism in evidence in the Middle East today is indeed of fairly recent vintage, dating back to the 19th century. It is indeed the product of the Islamic world's encounter with the West and its sense of subjugation, felt perhaps most strongly and acutely, as we have seen, in the example of the emergence and flourishing of Israel. But this sentiment is rooted in and makes sense only with a reference to the older Islamic idea of the Jew as a member of an inferior, defeated people. Modern anti-Semitism in the Middle East draws heavily on this heritage of contempt and feeling of superiority. And as I mentioned before, it could indeed be argued that it's precisely the Jew's status, traditionally as a despised and somewhat ridiculed figure in the Middle East, which makes his current rise and ascendancy a matter of such anguish in large parts of the Middle East, and the restoration of the proper order of things such a matter of urgency. That this despised figure can rise up demonstrates just how far the Middle East and Islamic world have fallen in the sentiments of millions of Middle Easterners today. And I would suggest that it's this aspect above all others which lends anti-Semitism in the contemporary Middle East its particular fervour and virulence, and which is likely to ensure it'll be with us for a long time until a radically new way of viewing both recent and maybe older history takes hold in the Middle East. Movements of political Islam are dominant in the Arabic-speaking world today, and they both reflect and advocate the near ubiquitous anti-Semitism of the region which I've been talking about and going through. So I want now, in the final part of this talk, to take some examples from two such movements, perhaps of particular interest at the present time, namely, as I said, the Lebanese Hezbollah organization and the Palestinian Hamas organization. Both these movements are openly anti-Jewish movements, and expressions of anti-Semitism are to be found both in the formative documents and in the statements of their leaders. And in both cases, as we shall see, these expressions draw both on perceptions deriving from the Islamic world and those emerging from the West. So let me begin with a quote, and I have a few quotes to tempt you with over the coming minutes, but let me begin with a quote, and I'll read the quote before I reveal to those who won't immediately identify it the speaker. This is the quote. But I'll tell you, among the signs and signals which guide us in the Islamic prophecies is that this state of Israel will be established and that the Jews will gather from all parts of the world into occupied Palestine, not in order to bring about the Antichrist and the end of the world, but rather that Allah, the glorified and most high, wants to save you from having to go to the ends of the world, for they've gathered in one place. They've gathered in one place, and there the final and decisive battle will take place. Who does that sound like? Nasrallah. It's Nasrallah, of course. It's our good old friend, Hasuna, as we call him in the neighborhood, the former now Secretary General of the Hezbollah movement, former leader, now retired, comfortably or otherwise. Speaking, what's that? He didn't retire. He retired. Well, he's no longer in office. Missing in action. All right. So, MIA. This is him speaking in Beirut back in 2002. Much of Hezbollah's attitude towards the Jews you can hear in that quote. The statement, if we think about its wording, manages a kind of seamless combination of anti-Israeli and anti-Jewish sentiment in which the politicidal ambitions regarding Israel are frankly and unambiguously located within an anti-Jewish world view. Again, this worldview is theological and it is essentialist. That's to say, Israel is seen as iniquitous in nature, not because it represents a deviation from Jewish doctrines or essence, which, by the way, is how some anti-Zionist formulations see it, as you know, but rather because it's seen as the realization precisely of this essence, foreseen, according to the speaker, in both Islamic and indeed non-Islamic scripture. The current Hezbollah leader, Sheikh Naim Qassem, is also a rich repository of similar expressions, and this is partly because Sheikh Naim Qassem was for a long period of time regarded mainly as a theoretician and ideas man of Lebanese Hezbollah. As you know, Israel killed Hassan Nasrallah in the course of the war of last year, and you'll probably remember that Israel also killed his successor, Hisham Safiuddin. And at that point, Naim Qassem, I think surprisingly for many of us, took on the job of Secretary General. As a result of which it's an interesting moment because we have a very, very rich, because this man wrote a lot before becoming leader, we have a very, very rich literature, so to speak, of the thoughts and sayings, if I can put it that way, of Naim Qassem with regard to the Jews and Israel. Indeed, Naim Qassem's book is even translated into English. Here it is. It's called Hezbollah, The Story from Within. And I strongly recommend anybody interested in this stuff to get a copy of it. It's easy to find and very interesting read as well. To quote a little bit from Sheikh Naim Qassem in the book, Naim Qassem characterizes the motivations behind Zionism in the following terms. Quote, "The Zionist project was formed with a focus on religious fanaticism and Semitic prejudice, using the most dreadful of methods to achieve the project's aims." And elsewhere, the basic foundation, this is a very interesting quote, "The basic foundation of the racially prejudiced Zionist movement is expansion, an aim supported by religious foundations drawn from the Torah. According to the Torah," says Qassem, "Palestine is an inheritance for the people of Israel whose lives, except through the expulsion of Palestine's original inhabitants, could not be made whole." Why is this statement, in my opinion at least, particularly interesting and worth pausing on? Firstly, for the obvious reason that it contains within it a theological critique, if I can put it that way, a very extreme critique of Israel and Zionism, based on claiming that it draws itself from the foundations of Jewish religious texts. But there's an interesting sentence here which is very much Hezbollah. You won't really find this so much in other movements. Sheikh Naim Qasim uses the phrase racially prejudiced Zionist movement. Isn't that a bit strange? In the same paragraph, we have a claim that Jewish religious texts lead their adherents towards dreadful and iniquitous forms of behavior. And then at the same time, in the preceding sentence, there appears to be a kind of criticism of racism or of racial prejudice. It's odd, and it's very characteristic of Hezbollah, and not only of Hezbollah, but of many other movements deriving from the Iranian and Shia school of political Islam. Why so? This school, authentically, not only for purposes of propaganda, was very much influenced by the so-called sort of anti-imperialist and third worldist left of the 60s and 70s. And its philosophy is a kind of attempt to combine that with political Islam. You don't find this in the Sunni world anything like as much. So it's interesting. It doesn't get them off the hook, of course, but it's interesting from an analytical point of view. Another quote. I have a bunch. Let me choose. I don't want to be talking at you all day. Well, we have here something from Ayatollah Muhammad Hussein Fadlallah, one of the chief ideological fathers of Hezbollah. Again, many of you are probably familiar with this person. And Ayatollah Fadlallah says the following. The Jews want to be a world superpower. This racist, again, interestingly, circle of Jews wants to take vengeance on the whole world for their history of persecution and humiliation. In this light, the Jews will work on the basis that Jewish interests are above all world interests. No one should imagine that the Jews act on behalf of any superpower or minor power. It is their personality to make for themselves a future world presence. Naim Qasim in his writings also contains example of that Islamic theological view I mentioned before, which views the Jews as a uniquely cunning and malicious enemy. And in this regard, let me just briefly take something from his book, where he cites two other figures, each of whom, as we should know, are essential in understanding Hezbollah's view on Israel and the Jews, namely Ayatollah Khomeini of Iran, and secondly, the mythical, revered figure of the 12th Imam, Imam al-Mahdi, whose reappearance in 12 Shia eschatology is meant to trigger the end days. But I won't read the whole quote, but I'll just read a little bit to give you a sense of it, and maybe to help out Naim Qasim by encouraging you to buy his book, as one author to another. The saying is the following. It is not permissible to squander the land of Muslims or that which is sanctified. Rising to their defense and liberation is a natural obligation for which all Muslims are liable. As Imam Khomeini declared, the extortionist government of Israel, through its tendentious plans for Islamic nations and Muslims, represents a great danger. It is feared that confrontation may become impossible should Muslims show lassitude. Given that the danger is directed at the very essence of Islam, it is the duty of all Muslims, and specifically of Islamic states, to take the initiative for the obliteration of this pond of decay with all possible means, and not to decline the Mujahideen any assistance towards this end. And having quoted Khomeini, Sheikh Naim then goes on to quote the Quran itself, a passage from the Quran, from Surah number 17. And then he goes on to discussing Imam Mahdi, and he says that when asked where this part, the Prophet said, in Bayt al-Maqdis, Jerusalem, and under its wings. Tradition also speaks of the appearance of the 12th Imam, Imam Mahdi, who will work to purify Jerusalem. The reason why that's interesting, again from the theological point of view in a way, is because traditionally in Shia Islam, Jerusalem has been not very important. And what's going on here, what Sheikh Naim Qasim is trying to do, is actually he's taking a motif which was traditionally one much more associated with Sunni Islam, namely the issue of Jerusalem and the presence of Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, and he's trying to place it into a Shia context. So once again then here we have the essential view of Hezbollah towards the Jews cogently expressed. And last example I want to bring, maybe no less interesting an example, comes from the work of a researcher called Amal Saad Ghorayeb, who some of you may have heard of. She is Lebanese, British Lebanese actually, but based in Lebanon now. And the interesting thing about Amal Saad Ghorayeb, and the reason why I bring her example here, is because she's a very strong supporter of Hezbollah. So in her book, and I have Amal's book here as well, Hezbollah, Politics and Religion by Amal Saad Ghorayeb, This is a treatment of Hezbollah ideology and history. This is a supporter of Hezbollah, which is why, in my view at least, her views regarding the view of Hezbollah towards the Jews are particularly interesting, because this is not a person who's out there to try to accuse Hezbollah. Actually, she likes Hezbollah. And from this point of view, then I think we can take her expressions with a certain amount of credibility. And what does Amal Saad Ghuraib have to say about Hezbollah view of the Jews? She quotes another time Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah in the following terms. She says, bearing these considerations in mind, it becomes easier to discern Hezbollah's attempts to Judaize Zionism and the Israeli state, as when it proclaims that the dreams of the Israelites are over. These attempts are also manifest in the party's transference of negative Jewish traits to Zionism and Israeli society. This tendency is best exemplified in one of Nasrallah's diatribes against Israel. Here she quotes Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah again. If we search the entire world for a person more cowardly, despicable, weak and feeble in psyche, mind, ideology and religion, we would not find anyone like the Jew. Notice, says Sayyid Hassan, I do not say the Israeli. Now, in a way, this is kind of nice of both Sayyid Hassan and Amal Saad Ghuraib, in that they're making the work of researchers easier, because they're getting rid of any possible ambiguity, right? Nobody can really come along and say, yeah, but actually they're not, no, they only mean Israelis. No. They're very clear and very honest and very straightforward. But Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah and Amal Saad are talking about Jews. And the centrality of Jews is central to their own view and analysis, and that of their movement of the issue of Israel. Thus far then, with regard to Hezbollah, because through shortage of time, I have a whole bunch of other material of that kind, but I'll spare you from it. I do want, however, to bring a few examples from the Hamas corner in order to demonstrate a similarity of outlook. And again, a notable difference, I think, is the absence in Hamas statements and literature of any effort, or at least any remotely credible effort, to utilize the language of the left and of anti-imperialism. Hezbollah does that quite a lot. Hamas, in its own literature, hardly ever does. And this is because it's coming from a different ideological background, that of the Muslim Brotherhood, Sunni political Islam. It's another ideological construct, I would suggest. So, first quote, well, we know about Hamas Charter, Article 7. The hour of judgment shall not come until the Muslims fight the Jews and kill them, so that the Jews hide behind trees and stones, and each tree and stone will say, O Muslim, O servant of Allah, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him, except for the Gharqad tree, because it is the tree of the Jews. This is an example, of course, of open anti-Jewish prejudice. This is not a Hamas spokesman speaking or a particular individual. This is the foundational charter of the movement. And indeed, the charter contains a number of interesting additional examples. Article 32, for example, Hamas regards itself as the spearhead and the vanguard of the circle of struggle against world Zionism. Islamic groups all over the Arab world should also do the same, since they are best equipped for their future role in the fight against the warmongering Jews. There is, I think we can see a certain interesting element creeping in here, where the accuser appears to be sort of accusing the Jews of what he himself is guilty of. So here is Hamas arguing for a global, endless, warlike struggle against who? Against warmongers, right? The Jews are warmongering, so endless war until victory must be made against them. We can see a similar thing, I think, with Hezbollah and the Shia side with regard to racism. So we heard before the Hezbollah accusation, which is all Jews are incurably and essentially racist. It's kind of wonderful in the sense that the accusation is contained within the statement itself. Well, I mean, the accusation is turned round if we think of the statement carefully. The charter famously, Hamas Charter, I mean, was revised, as I'm sure you've come across and are aware, in 2017. And the new charter is notable because it has very clearly removed any open reference to Jews. What happens is simply that the same accusations are there, but the word Jew is replaced by the word Zionist. So it's an interesting question to ask ourselves, has the new charter led to a more general change, or did the new charter lead to a more general change in the language employed by Hamas with regard to the issue of Jews and Israel? And the answer, I guess, predictably is no. In other words, we can find a rich harvest of examples of very openly anti-Jewish statements by Hamas spokesmen and leaders, even in the post-2017 period, when supposedly Hamas had moved on from this earlier time of open anti-Jewish prejudice to something more sophisticated and complex. So, for example, let me bring just a couple of examples from here. We have a quote from July 12th, 2018, at a rally broadcast on Hamas Al-Aqsa TV station by Fathi Hamad, a spokesman for the movement, saying, quote, "The cleansing of Palestine of the filth of the Jews and their uprooting from it, Allah willing, and the establishment of the caliphate after the nation has been healed of its cancer, the Jews, Allah willing, is imminent." Similarly, June 23rd, 2019, again on Al-Aqsa TV, Hamas parliament member Marwan Abu Ras says, "Everything people say about massacres and Holocaust, these are all lies. Hitler may have hated them, but it was because of their deeds and crimes." Another couple of examples. Here we have Hamad al-Rajib, Hamas official, in an April 2023 sermon, just a few months before the outbreak of the current war. And al-Rajib says he prays for the annihilation and paralysis of the Jews, who he describes as filthy animals. And he says the following: "Allah transformed them into filthy, ugly animals like apes and pigs because of the injustice and evil that they had brought about." So there's much, much more of that, but I'm not going to ask you to spend your time listening to it. Suffice it to say that perusal of these statements shows the extent to which both Hamas and Hezbollah fit comfortably into the combined influences which we located in accounting for the perennial and ubiquitous nature of anti-Semitism in the Arabic-speaking world. That is, there are the references to Islamic tradition and to the traditional Muslim image of the Jew as one both weak and corrupt and characterized by cunning and cruelty in his relations with Muslims. There is the traditional Islamic view that the natural state of affairs and the arrangement which alone can guarantee peace and stability is one in which Islam is dominant and the Jews and Christians are subordinated to its rule. But there is also the clear presence of motifs emerging from Western and Christian anti-Semitism. Hamas's referencing of the Protocols of Elders of Zion, for example, Hezbollah's reference to Jewish plots for world domination, and so on. And in all these aspects, Hamas and Hezbollah can be comfortably located within the mainstream of thinking in the Arabic-speaking world regarding Jews and Israel. And it's important, I think, then, to understand these movements and those similar to them throughout the region as existing within the historic current of thought in the region and not against it, and not in the fringes of it. And I would say this is particularly important not only for the purposes of analysis, but also for the purposes of policy making. That is to say, in order to avoid illusions which can produce faulty policy with sometimes tragic results. Lastly, and just briefly, we should remind ourselves, by way of conclusion, that neither Hezbollah nor Hamas are debating clubs. That is to say that the ideas under discussion here are not under discussion simply because of their inherent intellectual interest or lack of interest, or quality or lack of quality. Rather, they're of interest to us primarily because they form the basis for a praxis, a political and military praxis which is impacting hugely on the realities of lives. And of course, we can think of many examples of the fact that both Hezbollah and Hamas, in their praxis, in terms of location of their enemies, do not differentiate between Israelis and Jews, but rather target both Israel, of course, and Israeli Jews, but also non-Israeli Jewish communities throughout the world. Most famously, perhaps, the destruction by Hezbollah, for example, of the Amia Community Center in Buenos Aires in 1994, a Jewish community center with no direct link to Israel. But there are many other less well-known examples, up to and including 2019, 2020, when we were were following closely the arrest in Germany, for example, of Hezbollah operative who was discovered when he was carrying out initial intelligence on synagogues and Jewish community centers in Germany, if I remember correctly, in the Berlin area, but I would need to go back and check that. I think it needs only to be said by way of conclusion that the extreme dehumanization of Israeli Jews visible during the massacres of October 7th, 2023, in a way belongs also within the spectrum of the ideas being discussed and outlined in this lecture. So finally, let me say that anti-Jewish sentiment in the Arabic-speaking world is near universal, and the particular nature of this sentiment, both because of its roots in older Islamic perceptions of the Jew and in its influence or absorption of Western anti-Semitism, makes it immensely difficult in the Arabic-speaking world for that world to accept the Jew as an equal, or still less as a sovereign neighbor. Deep change is required, I think, within those societies themselves before this will become possible. And finally, really finally, it would be remiss of me, I suppose, to conclude without noting that we are currently in a period of open military confrontation between the adherents of the ideas I've been discussing here and large numbers of young Jewish men and women who are currently engaged in defending our interest and our people against the efforts of the adherents of these philosophies. And I think we should also constantly, be keeping those people in our minds as we discuss these important matters. So thank you, and I'm very happy to take your questions and comments.
So, Jonathan, very quickly, I'll start off with a quick question. Thank you. It's a tour de force. Your knowledge is amazing, from the roots to the contemporary. So to zoom out a little bit more, with Hezbollah and Hamas, vis-a-vis the war maybe on the 8th front, the propaganda front, we have Hezbollah connected to the Iranian revolutionary regime, which has been weakened at least kinetically, and Hamas, the leadership still is sitting in Qatar. So, and the Qataris are funding Hamas and brotherhood activities in the United States and around the world. Can you comment on this aspect of the war against Israel and the Jewish people, kind of on the 8th front, if you will?
Yeah, so we'll take one question at a time.
Sure, as you
yeah, I'm happy to do that. Yeah, I will. Frankly, I would wish to comment on that front of the war. I think people here know this matter as well or better than I, by saying that I think it represents a paradox in the following way. I think that Israel has been tremendously successful on a number of fronts. In Gaza, the issue is complex, but nevertheless, from a military point of view, the force that carried out the massacres on October 7th, 2023 hardly exists anymore. But it's less complex or difficult to see the achievement in the other fronts. In Lebanon, in Syria, obviously, there's something historical has taken place. In Iran itself as well. Israel has, on the conventional military plane, generally performed extremely well across the whole variety of fronts in the region. And I can say that as somebody who travels frequently in those areas and has been watching those fights and those processes for a long time. And at the same time, by contrast to that, it seems to me at least, Israel has been basically comprehensively defeated on the level of the information and political war that you're talking about. And arguably, this in the longer term may be of no less importance. The fact is that while Israel, for example, has been busy dishing out blows to its Islamist enemies, including the organizations I was talking about earlier, at the same time, those organizations have been turning their very weakness and turning their very defeat, and specifically the Hamas one, into resounding political victories in the West, in which Israel, I think I can say, finds itself more isolated now, and not only isolated in the media or in the discussion level, but really politically isolated with potentially very tangible results than at any time, certainly in my living memory, and I think maybe even since the establishment of Israel itself. So yeah, on this front, we are not doing well at all. We really have not managed, for all kinds of reasons we can go into, but I think also largely, among other reasons, not always under our control, but also largely because of our complete neglect, actually. I mean, the neglect by the State of Israel of the importance of this front, whilst at the same time our enemies, and most specifically the Emirate of Qatar, understood early on the absolute centrality of this front and invested hugely in it, not only in media, but also in NGO sector, and also in the education sector as well. So we're now facing the outcome of all that. And I think it's, I think it's profoundly important, and we need to address this matter urgently.
So in a way, we're on the front line of a front of a war.
Definitely.
We the professors.
Can I just follow up and ask you to elaborate a bit? So I think we're all agreed that in terms of the cognitive war, we're well behind. And you suggested that it was in large part the investment by the Qataris in NGOs and in various educational institutions. But I wonder if you think that there's a susceptibility that we have to being so receptive to those investments. Is it just about money in institutions, or is there something else that's going on from your perspective?
Yeah, it's a great question. No, I totally agree, I think, with the sentiment, with the thought behind the question. It's not only about proactive activity by a very sophisticated and very wealthy state, although that comes into it, as we see ISGAP, among others, have been doing remarkable and groundbreaking research, getting down to the nitty-gritty of what they've been up to.
And the Middle East Forum.
And the Middle East Forum. But it's not only about that. It's about, I think it was Arthur Koestler or somebody came up with this metaphor of like a key and a lock, meaning that if you want to change history, you need both. You need the key, i.e. the subjective factor, but you need the lock as well, the objective conditions through which the key can make its presence consequential. And yeah, the objective factors here, I think, do relate to aspects of Western society itself and of the particular stage we find ourselves at, I think, in terms of ideas, because one of the reasons why the Qataris and this whole notion of theirs, the sanitization of murderous political Islam, which I think is what they've been up to, is doable, is because it injects itself into a much broader intellectual context in which such matters as the decline of the very legitimacy of Western civilizational pride, for example, has been steadily growing in the course of the last 30 or 40 years. The immense sort of presence and centrality of notions of guilt and of colonial guilt and so on, and of the inherent blamefulness, if I can put it that way, of Western societies. These have also been busily growing in the West in the course of recent years, and they make an almost perfect fit between the two. I would say that Edward Said is the first and still the classic sort of one who pulls these two strands together. And his famous book, Orientalism, is the text of all this, which takes the one thing and the other thing and sticks them together. But I think that, so I do think that aspect and the centrality of that aspect, and of course the advancement of those ideas, largely not by Muslims here in the West, but rather by Westerners themselves, is the context in which all this has been able to grow. And I think it's been growing, and I think the war of the last 2 years has finally seen it burst out into the open. I remember that I had after the killings of the two Israeli embassy employees in Washington just a couple of months ago, Yaron Lachinsky and Sarah Milgram, I remember I had a discussion with, I won't say the person's name, but a really central and important and significant figure, a researcher of political Islam in the United States in recent years. And when the name of the killer, Elias Rodriguez, came up, my colleague's first question was, we've got to look into this guy's background. Is he a convert to Islam? And it was a fascinating question. I thought to myself, you're going to find out. No, he wasn't. And he wasn't. 20 years ago, that would have been the right question to have asked, right? If someone was doing killings of Jews in a Western city, you'd say, yeah, is there some connection to Islam? But Rodriguez, there's no evidence. He was not a convert to Islam. He was somebody who'd been around the Democratic Socialists of America, right? I believe in Chicago. That tells us something about what you're asking about, that it's not only about Islam and its particular pathologies of the Islamist world, but it's also about the difficulties and pathologies of the West, and a very, very dangerous, I think, meeting of the two.
That's it. Sam?
Okay. Thank you very much for your speech. It was amazing. I mean, the lecture, the areas we've covered. I have a question. Don't you think that concerning what you've been talking about, how on many levels, but mostly on the theological level, this became a problem for the Muslim world, that Jews have their own national movement, and wasn't kind of inevitable that Israel and the pro-Israel discourse would be beaten, since there's 250 billion people, million people, constantly churning out theological arguments and texts about why and how to defeat Israel in this war. That's the question.
Okay, no, let's have another one and then we'll answer both.
Can you pass the mic down? Thank you.
Hello, thank you so much for your presentation. It was very interesting. I particularly thought the bit about why Christians, specifically the ones that harbor anti-Semitic views, of course, view Jews as all-powerful, and given their fetishization of victimhood, particularly starting with Christ, it explains why they harbor anti-Semitic views, portraying Jews as powerful, and with Muslims they portray them as weak. Of course, it's not to say all Muslims, sorry, I'm just using it as a shorthand. I am not meaning to make generalizations. But for EDI, many of whom are, proponents of EDI equity, diversity, and inclusion, which is very popular, of course, in Western countries, particularly within academia. Many of them are former Christians, or many of them are very, very anti-Christian. However, they still use this puritanical framework, which is in the form of wokeism. So that enables that red-green alliance, where Muslims' weakness can actually be portrayed, as victimhood, which is a social currency in Western academia, and it also allows them to garner support. So my question is, in EDI, frequently anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are coupled together. Can you speak a little bit about the role of Islamophobia and the equation of the two, when most of the time they're not seen as equal, and the contentiousness of the word Islamophobia and its role in EDI? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So, if I can take both questions. If I understood the first question, you were sort of asking, was it inevitable that this level of opposition and so on to Israel?
Overwhelm anything that could be produced on the other side. Since there's I don't know how many times more Muslims and
I see what you mean,
other countries, and all of them virtually were thinking about this. For all of them, it was a tragedy, a calamity.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. I mean, to some degree, yeah. When we think about our own efforts on the informational warfare field where we began, there is a sense in which, we just begin from an immensely disadvantaged beginning, because there are so few of us compared to the massive, enormous Muslim and Islamic world. But having said that, I do think that the issues we were discussing here a moment ago are important here as well. When the Western world is strong, and when the Western world has a strong and powerful view of itself, in which Israel has a particular place, then the fact that the masses of the Islamic world may have a particular interpretation doesn't necessarily cause enormous consequence, because, okay, they're out there in Bangladesh or Indonesia or wherever, and they have a particular view, but this doesn't impact on Western capitals. These ideas have entered now into the Western mainstream, not only because of the presence or large presence of Muslim populations, but because of a particular climate, I think, in the West. Indeed, it's almost even really fascinating to note that much of the most fervent and passionate and virulent advocacy of Hamas and its cause in Gaza, and I choose my words carefully, it's not the Palestinian cause, it's Hamas's cause in Gaza which is being advocated for. It's taking place not in Arab capitals, which are often very skeptical and hostile towards the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas and all it represents, but rather in Western capitals and in Western campuses, and unfortunately also nowadays increasingly in Western parliaments and in Western chancelleries. So it's an interesting thing that it's not only about the size or strength of Muslim populations, it's also about what's going on in the Western world, I think. I would also like to add on this, although you didn't, this was the question I thought you were asking, although actually you were not, but nevertheless let me little bit answer this one too. I thought that you were asking, well, isn't the kind of the length and virulence of the conflict between Israel and its enemies inevitable because of the nature of Israel's emergence? And in this, because many people do ask that question or have that view, and my thought on that is the following: that this is not so, and we can find other examples to establish that it's not so, because after all, at the end of the day, the conflict between Jewish nationalism and Arab Muslim nationalism is a conflict of succession. It's a conflict of the type which happens when an empire collapses. In this case, it's the Ottoman Empire. And then distinct nationalities within the empire have conflicts of succession in which they, through conflict, demarcate the borders of new states, and then the conflict usually ends, right? That's what happened when the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed. It's what happened when the Communist Empire collapsed as well. The wars in Yugoslavia in the 1990s are an example of this. And those of us who are old enough to remember them, remember these were very, very intense and cruel wars indeed. But once they ended, and they ended with the establishment of new states, Slovenia and Serbia and Croatia and so on, then the wars ended. That's how these things usually end. Our war of succession, by contrast, has been going on now for more than a century and shows no sign of ending. What's the thing that makes it different to all these other ones? I would argue it's what we've been discussing here today. In other words, it's the role of political Islam and the place of the Jew in the imagination of political Islam. With regard to the second question about EDI and about Islamophobia, so look, I mean, I'm no great expert on this issue, which I know is a big one in the West, of Islamophobia and what it is or is not. My thought is the following. I'm somebody who is, of course, absolutely opposed to prejudice against people, any people, on the basis of their religion or on the basis of their ethnicity. I'm not quite convinced that there's a need for a word like Islamophobia to deal with that, simply for the reason that Islamophobia, as I understand the word to mean, is supposed to be a protection not for individuals of Muslim faith, but rather for Islam itself. Which it's a quite unique, I think, intellectual concept in which not only are individuals now, not only is the dignity of individuals now to be protected by the law, as it should be, but now apparently the dignity of an idea is to be protected. But this to me is a very strange idea. As far as I'm aware, at least, ideas don't have feelings. Ideas cannot be physically attacked or sacked from their job. So the notion of an idea having an inherent dignity that we're not allowed to assail is a very strange and dangerous one, especially because, at least in my humble opinion, the whole point of the open society should be that all ideas should be subject. Their dignity exactly should not be respected. Ideas should be able to be attacked by anybody at any time for a free society to work. So if I understand what Islamophobia, this idea, is supposed to introduce into the discussion, I think it's a very dangerous phenomenon indeed. And the fact of the matter is that I think what it really is an attempt to introduce is it is an attempt to introduce Islamic blasphemy laws and other concepts intended to prevent the idea uniquely of Islam from being criticized into the context of Western and democratic societies, and I think we should be doing everything we can do to oppose that, whilst of course being in support of any measures put in place to defend the personal dignity of all people, Muslims and non-Muslims alike.
And just as a footnote, as you know, these are ideas and concepts that were developed by the Iranian revolutionary regime and the Muslim Brotherhood and ushered into the Western democratic discourse for this purpose.
Correct.
I can project again. Okay. I just want to intervene on what makes this different again. This question of secession. Why political settlement? Why Israel's existence is still so fraught? Why it seems to never be accepted? Why all this stuff? And I think you did a wonderful job of explaining this amazing intellectual history earlier in your talk and how some of these things have mapped on. I have a suggestion, maybe something we can throw out, because it's a bit mysterious to me as well. I mean, I intellectually understand anti-Semitism and these things, but I think, drawing from what you were saying, that in the Arab world, it seems to me there's something particular, perhaps different from the Western world, in the sense of that Israel's existence, its powerful existence, is a kind of humiliation, a kind of continued humiliation. And I think that, strikes me first as a bit strange, but you can I think, come to understand it. But then this seems like a quite powerful emotion if we accept that kind of reasoning, because we've all been humiliated in some way, and usually you you can understand the asymmetry of that kind of reaction. It's horrible for you, but usually the people around you at the time, they have no memory of this, this thing that made you feel so horrible. So it's kind of weird in that way. And I think there's something like that, or at least taking from your talk, something like that going on in Israel's current status. Or what do you make of that?
First of all, I completely agree, and I think this is something which we touched on also in the discussion or in the lecture, because I think there is the sense of humiliation is exacerbated, I think, in the Arab Muslim context by the particular nature of the Jew, or at least by the particular perception of the Jew in the Arab world. It's uniquely humiliating to be humiliated by somebody who you yourself regard as inferior. Do you understand? Because if you're defeated by a powerful empire, it's not nice to be defeated. But listen, you're fighting against something immensely powerful. That doesn't say anything about you. Maybe you put up a good fight and you did your best, but the Christian West is immensely powerful. What can you expect? And you see this, by the way, in the Arab context, where the Arabs are good at portraying defeats as victories, by the way of saying, yeah, but what do you expect? We can't defeat these guys. We put up a good show. Yeah. With regard to the Jews, you can't say, because the Jew is a figure of contempt. You should be able to just brush him aside.
They're not supposed to ride horses.
They're not supposed to ride horses is a great way of putting it. And the thing is that if you look at it's really fascinating that if you look at the statements of people like the late Yahya Sinwar and others, you see instantly the movie that's going on in their heads. And this is why I think October 7th for so many of them was a reason for really great celebration, because October 7th for them, I think, was a return of the universe to its proper state, right? In which, immensely powerful Islamic warriors were with great amusement and patience, brushing aside the little attempts by the Jews to resist. And then, as we know, the rest of it I won't go into, but you know what I'm talking about. So this, for them, was the return of the universe to its proper place. And this, I think, was a deep reason for the celebration of it. And what frustrates me, I guess, as a resident of Israel and an Israeli citizen, is that this movie never seems to end. In other words, it doesn't matter what the results of each go-round is. 10 years later, suddenly the same movie is going on in another generation of Arab Muslims' heads, and they want to have another go. And it's frustrating, because you want to say, how many times do we have to go through this until you get the point that we're not such absolutely contemptible, useless figures? We're not bad at some of this stuff. So don't waste your time anymore on this. Get into other stuff, for heaven's sake. It's what I'm saying is the cliche, boring thing that Jews have been saying for a very long time to Arabs, let's say. And it doesn't seem to catch on. Now, I don't want to exaggerate the situation. The fact of the matter is that large parts of the Arab Muslim world, including power structures, have acknowledged this. Egypt acknowledged it in 1979, of course. The Jordanians acknowledged it in 1994. The Gulf have acknowledged it as well, with the exception of Qatar and maybe Oman, but UAE and Saudi Arabia also. So we have made inroads. But nevertheless, there still always seems to be enough energy of this other thing to produce political movements of one kind or another who want to have another go-round of this. And frankly and sadly, I suspect that the current go-round we're involved in is just our generation's go. I'm already old now, so my generation's go as soldiers was the Second Intifada. And this is now the next generation's go-round. And hell, I think probably in 20 years, for all we know, there'll be another go-round as well. So it's frustrating and it's tragic. It doesn't mean that we should abandon our own project, of course, and we're not going to. But it's a very frustrating and annoying, if I may say so, thing. And I agree with you entirely where it comes from. It comes from a perception of humiliation. And the problem is, if I may use your metaphor for a moment to go back to this, the problem you encounter from our side is the following. If I see somebody humiliated, or if many of us see somebody humiliated, then your instinct is to try to make it better, right? So you go to the other side and you say, okay, I understand you're feeling humiliated and angry. I get it. What can I do? Is there something I can do to enable you to not have this feeling so that we can then get on to normal life together? And unfortunately, the answer you get, just the answer in practice, not necessarily in statement, is yes, you can. You can cure my feeling of humiliation by ceasing to exist, right? And that's the only way you can do it. At which point, with the best will in the world, you have to say, well, okay, if that's what you want, I can't give you that. So as William Shakespeare said, then let it be a quarrel between us, because there's no other way at that point.
Also, just a quick intervention. I think it's actually more profound than humiliation. The Jews are the only other to have self-determination in that region. And from a political Islamist perspective, it's not permissible for a Jew or a Muslim or a Christian or a woman, and God forbid a gay person, to be equal to a Muslim. You have to sit below. You can't ride the horse. You have to know your place in society. So ideologically, this belief is at the core of the ideology. And then you import European genocidal anti-Semitism and a little humiliation.
If I may say, I think that's a really important
above
point.
the gun.
And I think something I'm glad that you said that, Charles, because that's something I often point to, and I think we should note this. Israel is in a certain sense against the trend of history. I don't mean that to make us feel bad about ourselves or worried. It's interesting to note in the following way. All other attempts in the post-Ottoman period to create either non-Muslim or non-Arab or non-Arab and non-Muslim polities in the Middle Eastern space, I mean in the Arabic-speaking space, not Turkey or Iran obviously, have failed. All right? And there have been a number of them. Some of them are ones that we might morally praise, other ones we might less like, but if we can think of a number of examples, the French in Algeria, the Lebanese Christians, and two separate attempts to create Kurdish sovereignty, one in Iraq and one in Syria, and actually one in Iran also in 1949, all those things have in common that they have failed. And that not one of them has managed to get across the Rubicon, so to speak, to full statehood and sovereignty. And they were all serious projects in their own way, and they all looked pretty promising for a while, and they've all failed. And the only one that has managed not to fail, to establish itself and then to defend its establishment, is the Jewish state. So in this sense, yeah, we are conceived by our enemies as against the trend of history. They've managed to defeat every other attempt, for heaven's sake, so why can't they finally get around to defeating us? This, I think, is also what frustrates them and makes them feel humiliated and so on.
So we're going to collect two quick questions, one from Professor Amsel, one from Dr. Chavez.
Yeah, quick comment. Is this right? I'll just do that. Quick comment is just beginning to take it to one step further. Once you get to that level that you talked about, it's not just about that. It's not just about they're winning or losing. It becomes a metaphysical question, as you said. It's the world is not in its right place. Not just I'm losing, right? But I'm allowing the world to be as it shouldn't be. And it becomes a kind of metaphysical thing. My question for you, though, is this. The question was raised up that there was a perfect ground for these seeds, right? The ground was very fertile. Just for simplicity, call it woke. I know it's a bad word to describe what we're talking about. But that there was a woke field ready to accept these seeds. But I was in Columbia for the last 40 years, and I remember thinking, 25 years ago, 30 years ago, I was thinking, it's so strange that some of these new ideologies that come in here, which have nothing to do with Israel, but somehow I could see they're going to cut. Right? I could see that they were going to cut, anti-Israel. With Said, it was obvious. With Chomsky, in some ways also because, right? I mean, he had particular animus against Israel. But even for all of them, it somehow it struck me immediately. So my question is, did woke enable anti-Semitism, or was woke designed? And this feels like a conspiracy theory, but I'm sorry. I get the feeling that it was almost designed, that the postmodern ideology was almost designed to be fertile ground for a critique of Israel. I'm done.
Thank you. Next question.
Thank you. First, thank you for your lecture, the substance, and also thank you for keeping me awoke after the lunch.
Awake.
Awake, not awoke.
Awoke. These symbols are distractions. DEI is a distraction, woke is a distraction. Israel is winning the military war, but losing the war of ideas. Hamas is losing the military war. Israel is winning the military war, but losing the war of ideas. Hamas is losing the military, but winning the war of ideas. At this seminar, we're supposed to be not debating, but so much coming up with some better ideas that we can translate and plant seeds all over the world. Because the thing that's going on right now, why is it not just the Muslim world, but why are non-Muslim nations rising up against Israel, rather than rising up against Hamas. I think that we have to come to grips with that, not only ideologically, but I would also argue theologically. And I would think that hopefully near the end of this session, Charles, we'll have some kind of action plan, not 1,000 different things, maybe just 2 or 3 things that all of us agree to do, you know, in terms of putting forth a more authentic, a more realistic, a more idea that makes people not only know knowledge, but feel knowledge. And right now, I don't think people are feeling Israel. They see the power of military, but they don't feel the, not just the raison d'etre, but what is Israel's calling to even exist? So now you have people who are Holocaust deniers. Now you have people who are Israel deniers. And a lot of this denial comes out of, again, ignorance and not being sophisticated, and we live in a disinformation world. But none of that should make us pessimistic. It's just to make us rise to the occasion. I don't like to lose, I want to win. And I think we should just struggle to struggle, we should struggle to win. And part of winning is defining what is winning. Defining what are the terms that we use that resonate with all people of the world, that resonate with all of humanity. I'm sorry, I guess I don't know if I asked a question or not, but thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, well, I can say that, yeah, I agree with what you said, so I don't have anything. It's not really a question, and I agree with you and your sentiments and what's needed here. With regard to what Lawrence, I think it is, asked, right? You call Lawrence? Yes, Lawrence asked. We've met before. Let me say the following. I mean, was this thing designed to be answered? So I can maybe use this question to make the following remark. I mean, it does seem to me that this particular complex of ideas that we're discussing has fallen on fertile ground, clearly. And the question is, why was the ground so fertile that it has taken on, like in Hebrew you say, like mushrooms after rain, you know? Look, my own sense is the following, and I say it with no particular joy, but it does seem to me that it has done so because it is connected to something deep in the bones of the culture, not in the Muslim world, there also maybe, but here in the West, here in the Christian or post-Christian West. It has resonated with something that's there beneath the professions of secularism and of modernity that are there in the West. And when I said that to a friend of mine in Jerusalem, he answered the correct response to that. He said, yeah, wait a minute. He said, what do you mean by that? He said, this guy's a very rationalist person, a formerly left of center person. And he said the following. He said, listen, here's how I know that ideas disseminate themselves. They need an instrument. They disseminate through education systems or through political parties or through religious institutions. There has to be an instrument of proliferation of the ideas. So you tell me what the proliferation idea or mechanism was for this thing you're claiming to be present in the culture. And my answer to him was, you're absolutely right. That's the right question to ask. I don't know the answer, but I know that it's there. It's there, and you know it when you see it. And our ancestors were not idiots, and our ancestors said, "B'chol dor v'dor omdim aleinu l'chalotenu." Right? People know what that means from the Pesach Haggadah. They knew that in every generation, men rise up against us to destroy us, and that God delivers us from them. And I think that ultimately we end up with something akin to that, i.e. that, well, this thing reproduces itself, and it does, and it comes again, and it's hard to know exactly how it got there, but it's there. We know it when we see it. Our enemies know it too, and they know how to connect to it. And so we find ourselves in each generation having to deal with one or another version of this, and hopefully organizing sufficiently and correctly in our own modest way to defeat it in the end. And I think we're right now in the midst of another of those processes.
But we're still standing.
Yeah, absolutely.
We'll continue to stand. So Jonathan, we've run out of time, so thank you very much, and I know you're giving another Thank you, everybody. It's 25 minutes, and we're back in the room.